right? Because coronavirus is a healthcare access issue. It's an equity issue.
Yep.
The economy is definitely a racial justice issue because that ties into, how our schools are run and our opportunities for advancement and so forth. So in a state like Georgia, North Carolina, I think was the other state where racial inequality was second.
Correct.
You've got large black populations,
right.
one, but also large, very educated black populations. You've got North Carolina A&T University, which is the largest historically black university in the country. Atlanta, you've got the big university center, Morehouse, Spelman, etc. So the racial complexion, I think, does factor into the balance of those issues, but also because people of color are now one-issue voters, they may just dovetail in ways that you view differently depending on your background.
Casey Hunt, healthcare, number one advertised issue, arguably, below the presidential ballot. Always sort of the top issue. It is number 4 on our issues. Now, of course, the pandemic in many ways may be the, quote, other healthcare issue that maybe healthcare voters are split, but maybe we should be combining those questions together. For instance, if you did it here in Wisconsin, which I have up, coronavirus and healthcare adds up to 30, the economy's at 32. So it's possible that's what we're looking at there when you see that healthcare is a little bit lower than perhaps we were used to seeing in previous years.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, Chuck. And I think that's certainly how those groups that have been buying paid media time have been looking at this breakdown. I mean, there is a reason why they are advertising so heavily on healthcare. And I mean, what is the message in the pandemic? It's that if you're a Democrat, Republicans are going to take away your health care in the middle of a pandemic when you're at, perhaps elevated risk of getting sick, where you're at elevated risk of potentially losing your job that perhaps has stable health care that you rely on. So, yeah, I think it's a little hard when you're using the construct most important issue. I mean, if we had ranked choice exit polling, the way they have ranked choice voting in Maine, perhaps we'd get something different here.
Oh, man, if we start ranked choicing exit polls, we'll never get out of here, Casey.
Nope, never will.
We'll never get out of here. Mark Murray, it's interesting. I've been messing around with this a little bit, doing some stuff that you and I might do with First Read. So check out Florida here. So the economy's at 35. And if our number 2 and 3 issues we know are going to be Democratic dominant issues, right? The pandemic and racial inequality. Mm-hmm. I'll be very curious to see if you add up these two in this, right? You're getting 34. And so in Florida, economy edges out 2 and 3 combined by a point. It'll be interesting to see in which states which have the advantage. I want to show you something here. In Wisconsin, for instance, on this question, you can see where suddenly it looks like a Democratic advantage on issues. 32 is the economy, but 35 is the combo on the pandemic and racial inequality. It's just one way to potentially slice up the issue bucket here as we look at Trump v. Biden.
Yeah, and Chuck, it's important on this exit poll question to look at the different choices. If they just given you 3 choices, we might actually have different numbers. But it does strike me that the economy is always kind of in the mid-30s. And of course, that was the issue that the president really has tried to talk about, not only in the final weeks of his campaign, but through the duration. And it's been interesting to me how crime, like his law and order and crime, has really dropped off recently. He's tried to talk about Antifa and others, but really the big kind of incident that ended up occurring was when you had that Biden-Harris bus in Texas, and the president, actually kind of almost applauding that kind of activity. And so really that law and order message to me wasn't as important down the stretch as the economic one. Just a final point on healthcare, Chuck, that you and Casey were talking about. One of the reasons why Democrats ended up having that in 2018 and it carried over to 2020 was just to have an affirmative type of issue. A lot of times the Democratic, focus groups and others, when they talk about the president and his own behavior in office and the actions that he's taken, that sometimes depresses their voters. And so actually having an affirmative goal on here's what we want to do. We want to actually expand healthcare for people. We want to promote racial justice in this country, specific ways to achieve that was always better in the Democratic messaging. And they always figured President Trump was baked in. So why not focus on affirmative kind of policies and activities?
Casey, Joshua, Mark, you guys get to stick with us. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to leave you with an exit poll result here. Time of your decision. A stunningly tiny amount of people claim they made their decision in the last week. We show you 2016. We know those late deciders were big for Trump. 13% of the electorate was a late decider. Look at this, though. 4%, according to this. When you have 100 million people vote before Election Day, I think you're going to have very few late deciders. Let's turn away from the presidential race for a moment and turn to the other big bid for political control hanging in the balance tonight, the United States Senate. There are 35 Senate seats up for grabs tonight, and how wide the map of winnable seats is for Democrats is likely to rely on how many battleground states Joe Biden can carry. A bad night for Republicans and Donald Trump could easily mean not just losing control of the White House, but the Senate as well. So let me go to a couple of southern states that Donald Trump won in 2016, where a win for a party at the top of the ticket could have dramatic implications down the ballot. We'll have a live report out of Georgia on the 2 Senate races there, but I'm going to first go to South Carolina. That's where we find Leanne Caldwell. She's been reporting on the single most, well, it may be, we'll find out if it's the most expensive Senate race in the country at the end of all this, but Lindsey Graham, Jamie Harrison, astronomical amount of money that Jamie Harrison has been able to raise and spend. The big question is it enough? Is Donald Trump's popularity just enough to drag Lindsey Graham over the finish line? Leanne, what are you hearing?
Hey, Chuck. So, yeah, it was an expensive Senate race. And remember, as you know full well, that South Carolina is a really cheap media market, too. So those dollars go a long way here. As for the president, so the President Trump won South Carolina by 14 points 4 years ago. That's more than McCain won it in 2008, and that's more than Romney won it in 2012. There's little indication that the president is going to win it, even close to that, this time around. And that spells trouble for Lindsey Graham, because both Senator Graham and the president have lost support among these suburban, moderate, especially the women. That's according to sources, and that's according to polls. But what's more troubling for Senator Graham is he is also trailing the president here in South Carolina. He's running 3, 4, maybe even 5 points behind the president. So he really needs those conservative voters, those Trump supporters, to put him over the finish line. This morning at a polling place, I caught up with the Democratic challenger, Jamie Harrison, and asked him about how he feels going into this big election day, and listen to what he had to say. Are you concerned in the final days that the math is just too difficult for you, that there are just too many Republicans in this state and that they're going to support Lindsey Graham?
I just said we have 1.3 million people who voted, and 30% of them African American, more than what their elected is. I feel really good about where I believe coming into today, I was in the lead. And I think we will continue that lead going in. So I'm energized. I feel good about where we are.
So he was in the lead partly because 33% of black voters here in South Carolina early voted. They only make up 27% of the population. And we spent the day at Democratic precincts, polling places, and there's not been any lines in places where there were lines in 2016 and previous elections. And we're told because just so many Democratic voters voted early. So what it's going to come down to today is how many Republicans show up to vote, Chuck.
And, of course, with Lindsey Graham, how many Trump voters skip the race, vote for a third-party candidate? We'll see. But I'll give you some math to play with.
Yeah.
If Donald Trump's raw vote number is at 53, 54, 55, probably means good news for Lindsey Graham. If it's at 50, 51, 52, Jamie Harrison is going to probably be a happier person. We shall see. Leanne Caldwell in South Carolina. Thank you. Let's go down the Atlantic coast there. Georgia's on my mind for a lot of reasons. Just about everyone else's mind around here, too. We'll have much more live election night coverage here on NBC News Now, right after this.
To today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you. Whether you're back to school,
what do you guys think? We're excited?
Or back to work, we're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Police murder of unarmed black men has been an American way of death across centuries. After seeing the most comprehensive police reform bill ever introduced in Congress, I've begun to wonder if now is the time. If now is the time the protesters finally win.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell. weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
You ready to go to work?
I'm so ready to go to work.
She's Joe Biden's choice to be next in line. But who is Kamala Harris? Join me, Joy Reid, as I explore her life's journey from Oakland to Washington on my 6-part podcast, Kamala, Next in Line. New episodes every Monday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
A real close-knit group of nurses who pulled together when their boss needed help battling coronavirus.
You're not just any patient. You're their friend.
These folks saved my life. Thank God that there are people who want to run towards a pandemic as opposed to running away from a pandemic.
Introducing the MSNBC Daily, featuring written perspectives by experts you know and trust for a better understanding of the stories that matter most. Check out the MSNBC Daily today at msnbc.com.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Are people there concerned about what impact this could have on the election?
It's news made for your streaming world.
Watch what they do, not what they say.
President Trump and Joe Biden hit the trail. At the center of this campaign, coronavirus. The story. The battleground blitz as we enter the final stretch of the 2020 race.
From every angle.
If you were sitting here talking to Joe Biden and President Trump, what would you want to tell them right now?
On the ground.
The wind standing these flames are expected to last another 24 hours.
And in depth.
We now have 2 vaccine trials on hold. Should people be concerned?
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Welcome back. We're going to continue to go down the ballot, down the Atlantic coast. We're in Georgia, as we promised you before the break, where there are not one but 2 very competitive Senate seats in play. One we know is going to a runoff tonight. It is that jungle primary, if you will. Every candidate is on the same ballot. That is the appointed Senate seat there, Kelly Loeffler. She's the appointed senator. It is going to go in a runoff. 2 major Republicans will split the vote. Democrats going to be the leading vote getter. It'll be very interesting to see what Raphael Warnock gets. But Blaine, I want you to talk to me about all things David Perdue and Jon Ossoff, because that is the nail biter tonight. Is it going to go to a runoff? And if it doesn't, that's good news, perhaps, for Jon Ossoff.
You know what? That's exactly the big question, and there's a very good chance that it could. There's a very good chance that in a couple of months now, on January 5th, Chuck, you and I are talking about this all over again, and there are not one but 2 Senate runoffs in the state of Georgia, which is just too much to even comprehend right now. But yes, when you look at that race between Jon Ossoff and David Perdue, there's a big chance that it could go to a runoff. Now, that's one that we've certainly seen a lot of back and forth over when it comes to enthusiasm, when it comes to people looking at that seat and hoping to turn it blue. I've got to say that the image, I think, of this whole thing, when you talk about enthusiasm in the state of Georgia, when you talk about the fact that there's been a record turnout, yes, it's because of the presidential election, but from the voters that I've talked to, Chuck, both on the Democrat and Republican side, they say that the fact that these races are so close, that's also fueling them to come out. That's also fueling the turnout. And I think that image-wise, you have to look no further than Barack Obama being here yesterday, coming to talk for Joe Biden, of course, but specifically for the 2 Senate candidates, Reverend Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff. And that image of them standing on the stage together waving is exactly what Democrats want and what they're hoping to drive home. Now, let's talk very quickly about that jungle primary. I spoke with Reverend Warnock yesterday, and I kind of asked him about the fact that, yeah, Georgia looks a lot different now than it did 4 years ago. And what does that say to him in looking at this race? And he said, look, it's not something that happened overnight. There's a lot of groundwork that went into this. Of course, we know that since Stacey Abrams lost that race, gubernatorial race, narrowly 2 years ago, there are more than 800,000 additional voters on the rolls. A good number of them are voters of color. Things like that. Other people going out, registering voters, trying to get people to the polls. He said all of that led up to today, and that's why Democrats are so optimistic, both in the presidential race and in those 2 Senate races, Chuck.
And Blaine, Senate debates rarely have an impact, but did that last matchup between Ossoff and Perdue, where he sort of, whatever you want to say, it went viral on Twitter, and Perdue canceled the next debate. Yeah. Are we going to look back at that moment and say, That's how John Ossoff became a United States Senator.
Absolutely, I think it had an impact. I think the fact that you and I are talking about it, how many people actually watch Senate debates that take place in states across the country. So yes, the fact that people saw that, the fact that people remember it, and the fact that John Ossoff and his campaign were kind of happy to be able to point to the fact that David Perdue pulled out of the next and final debate after that certainly bodes well for the campaign. But it also kind of goes back to what so many voters are really going to the polls for. I've spoken to a number of voters, and they say repeatedly, the pandemic and racial issues, that's what they're going to vote for. So when you talk about the pandemic, anything like that goes viral, certainly good for the Ossoff campaign.
We shall see. John Ossoff has basically been running for office since Donald Trump took the oath in the state of Georgia, first in the House race and now this. I think we'll find out if they continue. Blaine Alexander on the ground for us in Georgia. Blaine, thank you. By the way, if either of the Georgia races goes to a runoff, we may not know who controls the Senate until early 2021. Believe it or not, those runoffs are in January. However, if we are waiting for Senate control in January, I can tell you this, it means it wasn't a good night for Democrats tonight, for whatever that's worth. But there are other races that could give us a good idea. So let's take a look at how these Senate races could shake out tonight and in the coming days. Get to the big board here. First of all, I've got another fun little toy. Casey Hunt and Mark Murray are joining me. As you know, I am, Casey, you understand this configuration of the United States Senate. Most normal Americans do not. I always say, not everybody thinks that the United States Senate is always seated in the overhead shot in the Senate chamber. And I always think this is kind of a silly thing. But check out what we could do. We could put our Senate seats into the map of the United States of America. Anyway, I just wanted to show off my toy. I don't know how much more tonight I'm going to be able to do that. But in all seriousness, Casey Hunt, where are Republicans now when it comes to the Senate? Do they think they still have a shot at holding this majority, and where does it go through?
Yeah, I do think that they still think they have a shot, but that could change pretty quickly depending on what we learn here in the early hours of the evening. I think there's still a sense that it's likely we won't know who controls the Senate and that it's going to take longer to figure that out even than it will to call the presidential race. But, that kind of goes the same way as the questions about whether we're going to see, is there really still a possibility for a landslide that results in an early call in the presidential race? If there is, so goes likely the Senate. So there's a couple categories here, Chuck, as people are thinking about this. The first, of course, is swing states, purple states, places that are currently held by Republicans. They're on defense. This is Colorado, which Republicans think's gone. Right. Arizona, likely the same. That's Martha McSally. North Carolina with Tom Tillis, probably the most critical one of these. And Maine, which is, of course, the Susan Collins seat. That's got some dynamics that are unique to Susan Collins, but it's possible she's going to be swamped by the national dynamics, even though she may have been one who would have been able to hang on. But that Tillis race is likely where we're going to see control of the Senate. It's really, Cal Cunningham's been dealing with a sex scandal the last couple of weeks. We thought perhaps was going to change the dynamics away from what had been basically a generic ballot test, but it really hasn't, as you know. And our poll had Cunningham, the Democrat, up by 10 points. So, if Democrats sweep there, do really well, then we're looking at red states. We're looking at Iowa, Montana, and South Carolina. If Democrats are winning in those states, if that's the conversation, the Senate is absolutely gone. Republicans want to project some optimism about Michigan, but if the national environment is what we think it's going to be, that's going to be really tough for them.
It's interesting, Mark Murray. As you see, I also have another toy in here. I'm going to make sure I use all my toys in this hour. I'm not sure how much of them I'm going to get to between 7 and 4 a.m. But as you see here, what's amazing is that I wanted to move more of these over in our little slider here. But we've got 10 races here. I'm not comfortable saying I know which way they're leaning right now. I moved Colorado, Michigan, and Minnesota into the Democratic column. I moved Alabama and Kentucky for now in the Republican column. But other than that, right now, Mark, we know Alaska's going to take a week before we even get all the results. There's 120,000 ballots and won't even start counting tonight. Arizona, 5 days it took the last time. The Georgia stories, both could end up in runoffs. One may not. I think that's going to be the story to follow all night tonight will be Purdue Ossoff. Iowa's, we know, is going to be tight tonight. Maine, ranked choice voting, is going to take a week to 10 days. Montana takes a while. The North Carolina race. And I'll tell you, looking at the early exits, Mark Murray, I'm not ready to say that we know how South Carolina and Texas are leaning.
So what you're saying, Chuck, is we don't have a lot of clarity. I think that's about right now. And look, Chuck, I do think if we are looking for some type of clarity, the states that you and Casey just mentioned, North Carolina and Iowa, at least have the potential to give us fast results. And of course, if they're close races that kind of go into recount, then yeah, we're not going to know for a while. But there's a possibility that we know who ends up winning North Carolina and Iowa. And to me, those have always been the true kind of test, like the tipping point for control on this kind of map. And so, that's kind of what I'm looking at. But Chuck, one other point here too is our friends at the Cook Political Report often note these races always go one way. Yep. And of course, I do think in 2016 it was kind of a half and half. But normally, the close races typically break one way in the election cycles that you and I have been doing this for a while. And I would expect that trend to continue. And so how the political winds are blowing right now, we don't know at this hour or so. Yep. But we might have a better idea 4 hours from now.
And more importantly, we know presidential vote and Senate vote go together. So the battleground states, Arizona, Georgia, got to keep that in mind, Iowa, North Carolina, and Texas. Keep that in mind. The presidential number and the Senate number are likely to be aligned. Casey Hunt and Mark Murray, let's get started. We got about 9, 12, 10, 11, 12 hours. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you all for being with us this hour, but we're just getting started. I promise. I'll see you again tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern right here on NBC News Now and on your local NBC station. That's right. Lester, Savannah, Andrea, and myself, we're going to be on through the night here as well as on your old school television too. And we're going to be here tomorrow morning. I'll curl up. We've got sleeping bags. We are ready to go. But for right now, stay tuned to NBC News Now for continuing election night coverage and more from the exit polls. See you soon.
Good morning. Welcome to Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you. Whether you're back to school,
What do you guys think? We're excited?
or back to work, we're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Good morning. Welcome to Today. We're glad to have you with us.
This fall, we're right there with you. Whether you're back to school,
What do you guys think? We're excited?
or back to work, we're keeping you safe.
I love being back.
Every morning on Today.
Police murder of unarmed black men has been an American way of death across centuries. After seeing the most comprehensive police reform bill ever introduced in Congress, I've begun to wonder if now is the time. If now is the time the protesters finally win.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 on MSNBC.
You ready to go to work?
I'm so ready to go to work.
She's Joe Biden's choice to be next in line. But who is Kamala Harris? Join me, Joy Reid, as I explore her life's journey from Oakland to Washington on my 6-part podcast, Kamala, Next in Line. New episodes every Monday. Subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts.
A real close-knit group of nurses who pulled together when their boss needed help battling coronavirus.
You're not just any patient. You're their friend. These folks saved my life. Thank God that there are people who want to run towards a pandemic as opposed to running away from a pandemic.
Introducing the MSNBC Daily, featuring written perspectives by experts you know and trust for a better understanding of the stories that matter most. Check out the MSNBC Daily today at msnbc.com.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news.
Are people there concerned about what impact this could have on the election?
It's news made for your streaming world.
Watch what they do, not what they say.
President Trump and Joe Biden hit the trail. At the center of this campaign, coronavirus.
The story,
The Battleground Blitz as we enter the final stretch of the 2020 race.
From every angle.
If you were sitting here talking to Joe Biden and President Trump, what would you want to tell them right now?
On the ground.
The wind standing these flames are expected to last another 24 hours.
And in depth.
We now have 2 vaccine trials on hold. Should people be concerned?
NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
We knew it was coming this year, 2020, an election year, but the year had other ideas. Bump after bump in the road, just to bring us to this crossroads. A president and a former vice president with very different visions.
I will work as hard for those who don't support me as those who do support me. I mean it.
With God's help, we will defend the right to life, religious liberty, free speech, and the right to keep and bear arms.
America will decide who will represent us. Our founding fathers started it, and generations have fought for more. That special power to pick our leaders. We have persevered. Now we choose. Now we vote. It's Election Day 2020.
Hey everyone, I'm Allison Morris. You're watching NBC News Now's special Election Day coverage. It is finally here. Presidential elections are always historic, but the U.S. has never seen an election or year quite like this. 2020 started with the impeachment and the Senate acquittal of the president. In February, the U.S. economy went into a recession. In March, the pandemic started, and we are still seeing record daily COVID cases. Over the summer, there were mass protests calling for police reform and racial equality. And here we are, Election Day 2020, in less than an hour. The first polls will close in Georgia and South Carolina, as well as Indiana, Kentucky, Vermont, and Virginia. At 7:30 Eastern, West Virginia and Battleground North Carolina, Bellwether, Ohio will all close their polls. The Hawkeye State has a near perfect record of picking the president, voting for the eventual winner in every election but one since the 1940s. Millions of voters across the country today are joining more than 100 million Americans who have already voted, that number shattering early voting records. We have reporters fanned out across critical states and counties. Look at that. They are tracking every development everywhere as this election comes to a close. But first, we start with the candidates. Joe Biden taking advantage of the final hours of campaigning today, making one last swing through Pennsylvania before heading home to Wilmington, Delaware to wait for the results. President Trump spent the day in and around Washington, D.C., stopping there at his campaign headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, to rally the troops one last time. NBC News, several hundred people are invited. That's where we find NBC News political reporter Monica Alba tracking the Trump campaign. NBC News correspondent Mike Memoli is in Wilmington, Delaware, covering the Biden campaign. Mike, let's start with you and three things. Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania. Both candidates have spent a significant amount of time there throughout the campaign and in these last days. How is the Biden campaign feeling about winning that state?
Well, where was Joe Biden on the final 3 days of this campaign? Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania. If there was one state that Joe Biden really premised his candidacy on in a lot of ways, it is Pennsylvania. He is from neighboring Delaware. When he was in the Senate, he was sometimes called the third senator from Pennsylvania because of how much he was engaged on behalf of that state. And the makeup of the electorate there is very squarely what Biden's team calls the Biden coalition. You have working class voters both in northeastern Pennsylvania and in western Pennsylvania. You have a significant African American vote in Philadelphia. You have significant suburban women, especially in the Philadelphia area, and a lot of senior vote as well. And that's what Biden's team felt is a unique coalition to him that he could win and win back that state. And as I've been talking to both the Biden campaign and to members of the Pennsylvania delegation closely watching results so far, looking at the early vote, they feel very good. Polling showed Biden with probably a 5-point average lead, and they believe that that's holding up and then some, despite some of the concerns, because remember, Pennsylvania was, of all the battleground states, the state with the least early vote. There was the most day of vote, and so that made it potentially susceptible to a late swing, but all indications from our exit polling as well are that there wasn't a late swing, that most voters decided well in advance who they were going to support, Allison.
Monica, President Trump flipped Pennsylvania in 2016. Does the campaign think they can pull off a win again?
Look, Allison, they think that the Keystone State may be where this entire thing comes down to in terms of how close it may be. That's why they invested so much time, which is really the most precious asset you have in the closing weeks of a campaign, which is the candidate himself. He was there over the weekend, the president stopping in 4 different places in the Commonwealth, dedicating more than 12 hours of time on Saturday to campaigning there. They really believe that that kind of turnout for them can be translated into turnout at the polls today. So we just got off of a campaign call with aides and allies of the president who are looking at what is going on right now and seeing very long lines, particularly in Pennsylvania, and they are blaring out a message to all of their supporters. Please stay in line, don't leave. Even if the polls are closed, we want you to stay there and cast your ballot. That is the message now that all of his surrogates are amplifying because they think this could be the critical state. Of course, the Rust Belt, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, crucial in delivering the president the White House back in 2016. Aides telling me they're not as confident about what they're seeing in Michigan and Wisconsin, but they want to be able to hold on to Pennsylvania. They're feeling a little bit better about what they're seeing internally so far in Florida and North Carolina. Now, those are 2 states that when those polls do close in just a little bit here, we will have a good picture of where the night might be heading. Pennsylvania, that will likely take days, Allison, because of all the mail-in ballots, of course.
Mike, let me ask you about some of these other key states. Joe Biden and Donald Trump locked in some very close races in a number of battleground states. Where does the Biden campaign see its path to victory?
Well, they say they have multiple pathways. There's the one that Joe Biden spent most of the closing days of the campaign beyond Pennsylvania. It was that a blue wall path. What Hillary Clinton lost, those had been a comfortable Democratic-leaning states in previous presidential elections. Think Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Then they have what they would call that Sun Belt path, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, as well as Arizona. The Biden campaign actually laid out today all the ways he could win, even if he doesn't win Pennsylvania, even if he doesn't win Pennsylvania and Florida. They still think they have very realistic pathways to do that. But the other thing that the Biden campaign tends to think when you talk to senior advisors is that, especially that blue wall group, they will tend to move together. So what happens in Michigan is probably also happening in Wisconsin and to a lesser extent happening in Pennsylvania. So they've always felt that was the surest pathway for the Biden campaign to victory. The problem with that one, though, is that it's also the latest counting of those states. So they'd much rather see an early and projection of victory in Florida and Georgia and North Carolina, which we think is possible, at least the early count, not necessarily the projection one way or the other.
Mike, Biden is expected to take the lead with early voters, but what was his closing message today to those folks going to vote in person?
You know, it was interesting because we've talked so much about what it's been like to campaign in a pandemic. I saw Joe Biden today that we really haven't seen since the early primaries. He was interacting with voters a little bit more. He was very reflective and nostalgic at times, but he was still committing to be a president for all Americans. And there was a poignant moment, in fact, when he went to Scranton, of course, his hometown. He actually went to the home that he spent time growing up in. And he wrote on the walls that from this house to the White House by the grace of God. So an interesting day for the former vice president. I was with him on 2 previous election days in 2008 and 2012. Both those days were flights to Chicago to join President Obama. But today he'll be here in Delaware, spending the night watching results with his family and potentially coming to the stage that's set behind me to potentially address the nation one way or the other.
Yeah, undoubtedly, Micah, a sentimental and emotional day, whatever the outcome. Monica, President Trump encouraged his supporters early on to vote in person, not by mail. He is still questioning the mail-in ballots, particularly in Pennsylvania. What are you hearing about any legal challenges the Trump campaign might be preparing or what they're considering here?
Republicans are very much expecting legal battles, Allison, and that's why they've spent the last 6 to 8 months preparing lawyers and election-related lawsuits. They are ready to deploy those, particularly in Pennsylvania, as you mentioned. And yes, the president falsely implied last night during some of his very last rallies of the 2020 cycle that there will be cheating going on somehow in Pennsylvania if they're counting ballots after Election Day. But of course, the Supreme Court ruled that that would be allowed in some cases. And we should again remind everybody, the president has sort of implied that he doesn't like the fact that after tonight ballots will continue to be counted. That's always what happens, and just to a higher degree this year because of the coronavirus pandemic and the volume of mail-in ballots, that will take longer process and depending on which state and state rules. So while he continues to raise the specter of widespread voter fraud, we need to remind everybody there is simply no evidence of that, and certainly not in Pennsylvania, though again, it will take days to have a full picture of what this will look like, which is completely natural given the health crisis, Allison.
Monica and Mike, great to see you both. It's kind of fun, all being dressed up. We're all out of the house again. It almost feels like a normal election day. It's kind of cool.
It's been
Nothing
great.
like election night, though.
Great to see you guys. Thank you. The polls in Pennsylvania close in less than 2 hours, and as we have been saying, this is a state that could decide who becomes the next president. Nearly 2.5 million people have already voted there, but some counties won't process their mail-in ballots until tomorrow. MSNBC anchor Ali Velshi is outside a polling station in Philadelphia. Ali, it's great to see you. I feel like we haven't chatted in a long time. President Trump was the first Republican to take Pennsylvania since 1992, winning the state by less than a percentage point in 2016. Peter Alexander and Carol Lee are reporting today that the Trump campaign is concerned about turnout there. What have you been seeing on the ground?
Yeah, so Donald Trump won the state by 0.7%, 44,000 votes. So he is looking to desperately to hold on to this thing. If you look at all the combinations of ways that Donald Trump can get 270 electoral votes, most of those ways run through Pennsylvania. If he doesn't win Pennsylvania, it's going to be a hard night for him. So as Monica was saying, depending on how Florida goes and North Carolina goes, Pennsylvania will become more important as the course of the night goes through. Here's the issue. We're in Philadelphia. Joe Biden's going to win Philadelphia. He was here. In fact, I think he's still here. He's been here all day. The issue is, will he win it by the kind of margins that Barack Obama had or by the kind of margins that Hillary Clinton had? Because a lot of places in the rest of the state are red. There's definitely a lot of strength, a lot of Democratic strength in Philadelphia County, where we are here, and in Allegheny, which is Pittsburgh. But the issue is turnout. Now, we're not seeing lineups right now at most polling booths, but we have heard upward of 65% turnout so far if you count people in person and mail-in ballots. Raheem Ellis was reporting upward of 70% in another part of Philadelphia. So no lineups here. In fact, I had people coming up to me saying, what can I do to help her? I brought food. I brought snacks for people in line. There's no lineup. There were lines earlier this morning. There have been about 50 instances of phone calls about voter intimidation in the Philadelphia area. We've heard most of those were resolved without incident. About an hour from here in Berks County, there's a problem at one poll where people are lined up and they have not been able to process the ballots, but they're working on that right now. But that's what we have at the moment. Largely peaceful voting going on, uneventful in Philadelphia, but this is going to become very important over the course of the next few hours.
Absolutely, and at least friendly people offering snacks, Ali, that I hope they left with the local MSNBC anchor who might be hungry.
Yeah, that's right. Feed the anchor. It's always welcome.
It's a great idea. Let me ask you, Ali, you mentioned this. Philadelphia is key. Joe Biden there today telling supporters that Philly could be key to winning this election. What are Pennsylvania voters there telling you about the candidates, even though we know that Philadelphia very likely to go in Joe Biden's favor?
Yeah, look, I've been around this state. Last weekend I was in Luzerne County, which everybody's looking at because it was a county that voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. This last-minute push by Donald Trump about fracking, about Joe Biden's position on fracking, he's hoping to have some impact, but not in Philadelphia. People in Philadelphia are not really worried about fracking. He's going to take his glasses off because they're foggy. I spoke to two voters, actually, just a little while ago at this poll, and one of the things Donald Trump's been saying today on Twitter and this morning on Fox is he's worried about this concept of delaying the outcome of the vote for mail-in ballots, counting them on Friday, is not only a bad idea and undemocratic and unfair, he said it'll lead to violence in Philadelphia. Philadelphia has had some tension in the last week. There was a police shooting in West Philadelphia, and the National Guard was out for that. The National Guard is here, but not for election preparedness. There are actually no indications of violence in Philadelphia tonight. Here's what two voters told me a couple of hours ago.
It was my first time voting in a presidential election this year, so I was really proud, and it was a very easy process, no line, just got in and out, casting my vote, went really well.
Donald Trump was saying earlier today, and he's tweeted out such, that he thinks this whole way it's going down in Philadelphia, including the fact that mail-in ballots can be counted until Friday, it's not just a bad idea, but it's going to lead to violence. He's talking about that. You look very perplexed by that.
I don't agree with that. I don't think it's going to lead to violence per se, at least not in my city, you know?
I feel as though in Philadelphia, a lot of us are going to be pretty neutral, it's not going to be a lot of violence here at all.
So that's the situation for us here in Philadelphia. We're obviously going to be watching the rest of the country very closely to determine how important the results from Philadelphia are to this election. Allison?
Absolutely, Ali Velshi. And, maybe after the election, when we're all back here at 30 Rock, we could talk about some kind of product, some kind of new business idea to help with the fogging glasses. I have not figured this out yet. You put glasses on, you put a mask on, and there's just no winning that battle.
I get people tweeting me all the time, put tape here, do that, put on your glasses.
Doesn't help.
This happens to me all the time. I cannot figure it out.
I can't either. We're going to work on that. You and I will come up with something, we'll get rich. Thanks, Ali.
Love it.
More than 10 million people have already voted in Florida, according to the state's Division of Elections. The county is along the I-4